There we go. We are live out on LinkedIn and via our live event as well. To anybody watching this, whether that be live in the moment or indeed on record, thanks for joining us. I am joined today by Chris Hatfield. Chris is the founder and coach at Sales Psyche. And we're going to be doing a bit of a live interview today. We're going to be talking about the myths around resilience. Whether you work in sales or indeed you're a sales leader, resilience is, I guess it's one of those words that gets bandied around as something you absolutely must have. It's key to managing our mental well-being. It's key to being successful in a sales role. You've got to deal with the knockbacks. You've got to deal with the failure, of course. But if you want to truly understand what it means to be resilient and how to build it, then today you're in the right place, which is fantastic. So Chris, first and foremost, welcome. How are things? You well?
Yeah, really well, Owen. Thank you for having me. Really looking forward to talking about this topic.
Yeah, not at all. Look, it's absolutely your lane, isn't it, in terms of expertise, and it's something that you work professionally in and around, and you're clearly passionate about. Love to just start, I guess, getting an understanding of how you ended up here. Why are we talking about mental well-being, resilience in sales, those sorts of things? Just for the people that don't know you already, a little bit about your story and I guess what brought us here today.
Yeah, sure. So like most people, probably 14, 15 years ago, I fell into sales. I think it still happens, but I like to think it's more of a conscious decision these days sometimes. But I did that, and I recognized very early on I suffered with anxiety, which wasn't just related to selling, but was part of it. And it led me down a curious route of wanting to better understand myself and how to better manage my mindset and stop this kind of feeling and these thoughts from impacting me at work and in general in day-to-day life. And through that journey of self-discovery and understanding and going on qualifications and courses, it's really given me a better way of managing, and now what I say is sort of serving me rather than sabotaging me, which kind of then inspired me through my journey of sales, then in sales enablement, to set up Sales Psyche just over 2 years ago.
And it's been some journey so far. You've had an incredible 2 years. We've been watching from the sidelines as friends of the organization. Tell us little bit about that 2 years. I'm guessing there are times where resilience would have played a role in your personal journey, not just in the people you're coaching and working with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I kind of live and breathe what I teach and what I coach on a regular basis, really, which I think is so important to be part of that and to obviously practice what I preach as well. I almost feel like the sessions I give, it's almost a pep talk to myself every time I'm still doing it. But yeah, in those 2 years, we're working with supporting over 1,000 individuals now through organizations that we work with, particularly focused on that sort of SaaS and tech space through those confidential one-to-ones, and more recently face-to-face workshops, which has allowed me to travel a lot more as well to places that I've never been. So, I'm really grateful for that. And I think it was 2 weeks ago we turned 2 years old, and I was in San Francisco with Meta, and just had a nice sort of moment to reflect what we've kind of achieved and what we're looking to continue to do.
Fantastic. It's a great story so far, and a bright future ahead. Let's get into topic a little bit. I guess we've entitled this "The Myths of Resilience," and you were very keen to talk about those myths and to try and just dispel some of them. We get that you need to be resilient, right? All of us need resilience, whether we're in sales or anything else. There's a level of resilience that just gets you through a day sometimes. And we hear it all the time in sales. I'm guessing you've also talked about the fact that it's something that you can develop. It's a skill that you can work on. It's something that you can improve over a period of time. I'm keen to maybe just understand, some of those myths. So you talk about the 4 main myths of resilience that most people believe in. That clearly means something to you. Most people think, geez, there's different types of resilience. Wow, okay, we've got myths around it. What are those myths? Maybe you could just run us through them really quickly as we then choose to dig into them, maybe.
Yeah, sure. And we can come on to this later on. But again, I think it's really important to be able to break down topics like resilient. There's actually sort of 5 or 6 components when you look at it, which we can maybe get onto later on. But again, it is something that is mentioned more and more. But I went to a talk last night, and I had to shout this out. The individual Bruce who was talking was saying, being resilient, telling someone to be resilient is a bit like trying to tell someone to calm down. Like, never in the history of telling someone to calm down have they calmed down. it doesn't actually work. So just by telling someone they need to be more resilient, it's not actually going to help. You need to understand how you can educate people around it. And I think the 4 kind of myths, to come back to your question, the first one, I think very much is this belief that people are naturally resilient, that we sort of like have certain people that they're just naturally more resilient than other people. And I can dive into these after, but I'll give you a bit of a headline. The second one, I think, is that people believe resilience is all about strength and that you need to be strong. You just need to be able to stand up to anything that comes to you. I think the third thing is grit is often mentioned a lot, and grit isn't necessarily always a good thing when it comes to or related to being resilient. And then the fourth one is we often just think about ourselves when we think about resiliency, when in fact it's actually who we surround ourselves with and how we consider other people.
That's really interesting. Can I guess a question just, and this is maybe around your first point there. So are some people naturally more resilient than others? Like, is that a thing?
In the short answer, no. And I think, there might be a perception that some people are, and based on genetics or personality types. But what you'll often find is if you go back through someone's life, there'll be moments that have made them resilient, that they've gone through that kind of experience around it as well. And the individual I went to a talk last night, he was actually talking about resilience, and he was mentioning, when you look at a lot of sports stars, for example, they'll have normally gone through some form of trauma where they then sort of have developed that. And it's very easy to kind of look at people, particularly in like sales and other people in the team, or if you're a manager and look at certain people and go, oh, they're naturally resilient. Or someone might think, oh, I'm naturally resilient to this, but you might just not be thinking about maybe experiences you've gone through in the past that have got you to that point. And I think it's a very dangerous thing to think that of others, and also for leaders to say it, because what you're then indirectly telling the team is you're never going to be as resilient as that person because they're naturally gifted with it. So no matter how much you work on it, it's not going to happen.
It's interesting. There was an interview that I watched with Gareth Southgate, whether you like him or lump him, doesn't matter. I think he had a really interesting opinion on this, where he said, what are the things that people at elite level have in common? Do they have many things in common? He said they have lots in common, but the one thing that is almost, it is almost a given, is that they failed at some point early in their efforts to do it. So most of them got let out of academy, had as I said, a trauma in life, had some kind of failure at a young age. And have learned to bounce back from that, because actually, if you get that later in life, it's almost too late to have that, and you don't have the mechanism or the resilience necessarily to deal with it. So it's almost like it needs building up through nature and environment, and the nature piece is just, it's probably will start out on a level pegging at the beginning.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think it's something you can develop. It's something you grow through with experience. But again, it's not thinking this person's naturally resilient or I'm not resilient. It's not a kind of binary thing. There's a lot of gray in between the black and white. So
I guess resilience often comes from those experiences and going through challenges in the first place. I think if you ever, I think what we're saying is if life is plain sailing, probably your resilience may be lower than somebody who has not had the fortunate plain sailing that person A have. How do you accept resilience, and how do you use it as a learning tool and something to learn from?
Yeah, well, I think it comes back to what I mentioned at the start of breaking down those components and understanding the different ones. And the 5 components are challenge, then commitment/community, personal control, permanence, and pervasiveness. So challenge is people who have got a high level of resilience here will see setbacks, knockbacks as an opportunity to learn rather than a paralyzing event. So, a deal falls through or something doesn't go to plan. Commitment and community. This is where people with a high level of resilience have got a lot of what they're kind of working towards something. They've got goals. They've got things that want to keep them on track. They've got people around them as well that they know can support them. Personal control is all around being able to identify what you can and can't control in situations, and not making everything about you if something goes wrong, but still being able to recognize where you could improve. Permanence is being able to see beyond now isn't forever. So not thinking, how I feel now, or I've missed target, or I haven't had a good day, I'm never going to be able to turn this around. And then pervasiveness is all about being able to avoid one bad moment in maybe work, like impacting your personal life, or for example, you have a bad month and then you go, I'm no good at anything. It's sort of you had a bad call and then you judge yourself as a whole and your whole sales career based on that call. So it's being able to break those down and then being able to understand, which of those do I feel like I'm strongest in and which could maybe I can work on and develop from it. Because as you say, some of it will be experience, but then each of those, there are different ways, and happy to share some examples if any jump out to you of how you can do that.
Yeah, I just want to dig into an example you've given there around the one bad call scenario. I think I can't remember. I love your analogies on social media, and one of the things I can't remember exactly. You'll give the accurate story behind this is around you wouldn't let somebody steal X from your bank account and throw the rest away. And I think it's like the analogy I'm transferring that into is, you might as a sales rep and SDR, you might make 70, 80 calls a day, whatever the number is, 100 calls a day, doesn't matter. One bad call and the rest of your day is gone, ruined. And it's really easy as somebody not in that moment to say, why would you let the rest of the day be ruined, and carry on as you were and that sort of stuff. But much harder in the moment. You've got to be able to segment that, separate, disconnect from it somehow, understand the emotion that's there, because you can't stop the emotion. I don't think it's going to happen. Understand it and use it and move forward. And I just wouldn't mind you just digging into that example, because there'll be a lot of people here who are individual sales reps, SDRs, individual contributors, who can absolutely connect to that scenario where they're having a great morning, 11 o'clock, somebody's rude to them on the phone, they lose a deal, whatever it might be that constitutes a bad call, and the rest of the day just becomes ineffective, hard to drag themselves out of that mood. And love to just get your thought process around how you would talk about dealing with that.
Yeah, I think again, it's so common and it's so easy, as you say, to sit on the sidelines and go, "Oh, don't worry about it. There's plenty more calls," or it's all about finding no's to get to the yeses, all that kind of stuff. That's true, but in the moment, you probably just want to give two fingers to some of that advice, indirectly or directly sometimes, and that's understandable because you're in a very emotive state. And particularly when you have got targets to hit and maybe you're not where you want to be, you're sort of thinking, well, every call counts or every deal counts, and that deal might have been something you were like, oh, this is a dead set, or like this is something that's mine. But I had Benjamin Dennehy, I was talking to him the other week actually, and he said something really well, is that you can't really lose a deal you never won in the first place. Like it's not yours to lose. And it's avoiding that detachment from it. But I think in the moment, it's first of all being able to remove yourself from that environment, and not saying like if you're in the office just walk out. I'm just saying take yourself away from the desk, take yourself away from that moment that has just impacted you, because there's something here linked to something called the 90-second emotional window, which is studies have shown that stress and these chemical reactions are designed to come into our body because they feel like we're under threat or there's danger. But then if we don't actually respond, or once the body recognizes that we're okay, within 90 seconds, it can kind of flush out the other end. Not literally, but the piece here is what often happens in those 90 seconds is that we react. We'll maybe say something out loud. This self-talk will be like, oh, my day's ruined, or how am I going to hit my target? Or we'll respond to that email straight away, or that Slack message, or, say something. And that's what creates this loop in our body to go, oh, there is a problem here. We need to carry on. So what I'd recommend people trying is a really simple thing. Next time this happens, because it will, and it's part and parcel of sales and life, is to get your phone out, or to get like your stopwatch out on your Apple Watch and put 90 seconds on and count to 90. Like remove yourself from your desk, maybe go to the toilet, maybe go and sit on the sofa if you've got one in the office, or if you're working from home, go in the other room and just count to 90. And there's a few things that happen here. One, you're removing yourself from the situation. Two, because you're counting, you're having to use the kind of logical part of your brain, which interrupts that primal part, which stops all these stories coming up. And again, it allows you to become a bit more of an observer of your emotions, sort of thing. Oh, look, that call has stressed me out or made me feel anxious, rather than wanting to react to it and then going back in 90 seconds going, right, what am I going to do now? Or how is this going to benefit me? If you're thinking, oh, that's it, I'm going to give up on calls for the day. How's that going to benefit me? And what are the other opportunities here? What else could I do here?
Really interesting. I was going to ask a question after that one. I think you've led me nicely onto it around self-awareness. So you've sort of touched there on, I love that word, being an observer, being able to observe yourself and the situation. and I was, creating the opportunity to stand out of it and get, to almost look on yourself and see, I'm feeling this, I'm labeling it as that, I understand it's that, and then the logical brain empowers you to go and make decisions on what the right thing to do or the best thing to do is, which might be a bit longer break to let that feeling subside. But yeah, be interesting to hear any mechanisms you've seen people use other than that 90-second thing, which I think is a great one, or any other sort of things that you think in that stage, this is a really good trigger to go and do X to get yourself out of that cloud. I guess it's, feel fairly kind of heavy on top of you at that moment.
Yeah, I think the first thing is to have self-compassion for yourself, to accept it's okay to feel disappointed. It's okay to feel frustrated or upset if a deal hasn't come in, because that's your target. You earn money from that, and that's important to you. And a lot of the time you probably care a lot about the company as well. So you feel like a sense of responsibility, which is a good thing. So I don't think none of what I'm saying is about changing that. As you said earlier on, those emotions are natural. And if you didn't feel them, then you'd be some form of robot, or you really wouldn't care about your job at all. And then you're probably not in the right place in the first place. So I think it's important to accept that and go, look, it's okay. Whereas a lot of the time we kind of fight against that, and then that trigger then causes us to get more stressed and more frustrated around it. Oh, why am I feeling like this? Well, think about it. If you didn't, how would that help you? Would you want to not care every time you lost a deal? Probably not, because it wouldn't actually help you in then going to look for the next one, or, turning things around from there. So I think that's the first thing, is that kind of mindset shift there. I think second is self-talk, is language of how you speak to yourself. Trying to avoid the words forever, or so I'm trying to change to things like sometimes or lately, or I'm never going to be able to be good at this, or I'll always be like this. Is lately I've been struggling with these types of calls, or sometimes I find it difficult speaking to these people. So it's not creating these kind of foregone conclusions in your mind there. And then I think the other thing, which I kind of alluded to in the previous answer, was when you're in a primitive primal mindset, a lot of the things will be statements that you're throwing yourself out, limiting statements. And our brains are like a Google search engine. Anything you type in, it's going to come back with evidence. If you're typing in, I'm not going to have a good day now, I'm not going to hit my target, confirmation bias, your brain's going to look for all the evidence to go, yeah, you're right, you're not going to hit target. Because or do you remember last time you had this in the month and the quarter, you didn't hit target? So there is changing it to questions. So asking yourself 2 questions, and a bit like imagining your brain's like a courtroom. The prosecution, your brain there is going, you're not going to hit target, you're not going to do this, this next person is not going to want to speak to you, you're not going to have a good day. Is where is the evidence that this thought is true, and what else could be true here? So where's the evidence that because this was a bad call, the rest are going to be bad? Well, there probably isn't any. Where's the evidence you're not going to hit target? You've still got 2 or 3 weeks left, or a month left of the quarter. And then what else could be true here? Well, what else could be true is the next call does go well. That person actually, are they going to get off the phone and think, do you know what, Owen's really ruined my day with that cold call? Probably not. They're probably just going to crack on with their day. So why should it let it ruin yours?
Yeah, really good point. Just to try and summarize this little part of the conversation, what I'm getting from it is that, and I think it's worth clarifying this, the feeling is the feeling, and it's probably the same feeling for you as it is as it is anybody else. The differentiator for me as a sales rep and what I do next and how successful I am is not, can I get rid of that feeling? It's, can I process it in a way that allows me to move forwards? And that's that psychological stand back, ability to observe, ability to, challenge yourself when you're thinking, control, and commit to doing something a different way, to the way that maybe your body is naturally telling you should do something. And that feels like that's the differentiator between somebody who would be back on the phone within a few minutes feeling positive, and somebody who would be using the rest of their day ineffectively, or not, maybe not picking up the phone again, which is a common thing.
It's how you take that feeling and not let it, as I said at the start, sabotage you, but how do you utilize it? How do you let it benefit you? So another way of looking at it, some people might have a feeling before a meeting or a demo or a call of, I'm really worried or nervous about this, is rather than just sitting with that feeling for a week or 2 or 3 days before and letting it impact your sleep, switching off like personal time, is, well, what am I anxious about? What am I nervous about? Well, I'm anxious that they might ask this question, or this person might be on that call, or this call might go this way. Okay, well, if it is, then what can you do? What's the question you're worried they might ask? Who can you go and find out from there? Who's the person you think might be on the call? Can you do some research about them before? What way do you think it might go? Okay, well, what are some of the, if they give you this objection, how can you respond to that? And then it's almost going into that meeting or demo, and when they do bring all these things up, it's going, oh, do you know what? If I wasn't anxious before, I wouldn't have prepared for that question, or I wouldn't have researched that person. And building it, then over time, you can start to build a level of gratitude towards these kind of feelings as well. And that's where that kind of level of resilience can start to be built as well, because you're understanding how this is helping you deal with those situations.
You've mentioned before about reframing failure. Can you share some of your thoughts around that?
Yeah, and when I talk about failure, I'm talking about knockbacks as well. And, you know, when things don't go to plan. I think not all failure was created equally, is kind of like stealing a phrase and turning it really. But there's 3 different types of failure. And I think the problem is we look at failure or knockbacks as this one type. And the 3 different types are preventable, complex, and intelligent. So preventable is where you look at it and go, do you know what? I probably knew this beforehand, but I didn't. I went against it. Like I knew maybe there was a process and I tried something different, or I had this information to hand and I just probably, it's an oversight from me. That might be down to the individual. It might be down to training. It might be that, you know, that person hasn't been trained in the right way, or it hasn't been reinforced. Yes, you might have a playbook on it. Have they really understood it? Maybe not. Complex is where you've done everything possible from your side, but unforeseen, uncontrollable circumstances have happened. COVID is a classic example, or like the prospect or customer being unwell on the day. You can't do anything about that. An intelligent failure is that kind of failing fast, where that comes from, as in you've never experienced this before. This is the first time doing it. It might be a new product, a new job, a new territory. And you want to kind of go through these experiences to understand, well, I'm not going to try that next time. That doesn't work for me. But I need to go through it to understand what does as a result. So being able to break those down is really important, because a complex failure will often mean you probably don't need to change anything. But if you don't look at it like that, you'll think, this didn't work, that didn't work. Well, no, you probably did all of that right. Yeah. It just, something happened outside of your control. So keep doing that. Don't change it. Don't doubt the process.
Yeah, I think you know, I never thought about it like that. And I think what's interesting there is, you know, there's only one really where you need to stand back and go, what do I need to change? The intelligent piece is interesting, because that's being in a laboratory, being a scientist, isn't it? That's how we advance the human race, through that intelligent failure, because no scientist sits there and says, right, I'll keep doing all these things, and it's right. They get it wrong, and then they get it wrong again, and then they just adjust and they tweak. And no different in sales. And the complex one, as you say, is I had a great example of this yesterday. An opportunity we've got in our pipeline, fairly sizable. Phone call came in on Friday to everybody across the organization. CEOs leaving, all contracts on hold for a month. We've got to just reorg a few bits, and then we can go again. But we haven't done anything wrong in that scenario. It's simply a case of that's life, and we're wasting energy, time, and effort being critical of ourselves or analysing that. The preventable piece, though, that's the really interesting one, isn't it? Because, you know, I guess there's 2 types of preventable. There's the one that you didn't spot, and the one that you did but made a conscious decision to go and do it anyway. And I don't know if there's a way of segmenting those, or thinking just framing the thought process around those differently. So I felt a gut feel that was wrong, but I did it anyway, or I didn't even think about that, and therefore I'm in this position. Are they different processes to get past those as well?
Yeah, because I think what can often happen there, and that's a great opportunity for coaching, and I think it's really important when you're working with someone around that, to identify what was the intention, or if it was yourself, like asking yourself, what was the intention there? Because someone might have gone against something, but it's important to understand their intention before you come down on them. Go, you sent it this email, or you sent that. Is going, what were you hoping to achieve from it? Because the intention might be right, and you're like, oh, okay, like this person might be thinking differently. It's how we evolve, isn't it? It's how we like evolve things like playbooks, and go, that was actually a really good idea, but maybe the action didn't marry up to the intention there. So I think on those 2, it's understanding if someone's gone against it, what's the intention behind it, and then the action, and then going, okay, well, what have you learned from it? Because it might be preventable, but it could also be an intelligent at the same time. Like some of these don't stand alone by themselves. Like complex and intelligent can go through there as well. They don't necessarily have to be one or the other. And with the complex ones, it's not necessarily saying it's going to make it any easier. Like deal you were mentioning yesterday. It's not saying, again, coming back to that self-compassion, that you shouldn't be annoyed, that you shouldn't be frustrated, that you shouldn't be like, oh, why is that person left? That's natural. It's not stopping that feeling. It's then just being able to recognize and avoid, coming back to that personal control piece that I talked about, resilience, of not then just overly judging yourself of, why didn't I do this? Why didn't I foresee this? As well, there's just some things you couldn't. And if you find that there is, then maybe it is probably preventable.
Yeah, interesting. I've heard you talk about, and I refer back to this regularly. You won't know that I do, but really inspired me around. I can't remember if you used the word bad or negative, but there's no such thing as a negative emotion. There's such thing, and let me just summarize my understanding of it, and then you can explain it properly. But what I loved about, and you were stood on stage somewhere, I can't remember who it was, CSO or something like that, and you were saying, there is no such thing as a bad emotion. There are emotions, and how we frame that emotion, how we choose to see it, is what's important. So we see anxiety, as you said there, as a bad emotion, or we see being sad as a negative emotion. But actually, it's an emotion. It's the same as any other emotion. It's how we look at it and how we choose to look at it that counts. Give me the proper version of that. But I use that a lot in my day-to-day with people because, of course, it's perception, isn't it? That's so important.
Yeah, and that's all it is, and it comes back to that self-awareness and emotional intelligence of understanding that all emotions are as signals. They're not threats. They're like the smoke alarm going off in the house rather than saying the house is on fire. It's not saying that, oh my God, this is a big problem already. But a lot of the time we see it as that. We see stress and anxiety, whereas the brain is trying to say, hey, you should pay attention to something. A bit like a basic example I use is when we're thirsty. When we're thirsty, we drink water. We don't go, oh my God, I hope I don't get thirsty today. Or when we're thirsty, we don't go, what would happen if I didn't drink for a week or two? Or like, oh no, I'm thirsty. We're like, oh, thanks, brain. I'm not going to get dehydrated today. And I know it's a really simple example, but it's almost, that's where we want to get to the point with other emotions as well. And it's not as easy as thinking that way, but it's being able to see it as that, as a way to start looking at it, is to go, well, what is this trying to tell me when I'm feeling stressed, when I'm feeling anxious? And this is something that I still do. What am I anxious about? What am I worried might happen? And what are one or two things I can do to reduce the chance of that happening, so that I can actually create a forward focus plan rather than just feel static and allow this emotion to sort of control me.
Yeah, very interesting. Let's go back to those 4 myths. So we kind of touched on the being naturally resilient. That's a myth that we've dispelled in this conversation already. So it's not a natural thing. It comes through our experience and our mindset. Strength. People are just strong. They're not strong. Talk me through that one.
Yeah, I think it's not about being strong to be resilient. It's about being flexible and adaptable, because I think the perception is, if we say it's about strength, there's a feeling of we need to bottle everything up. We can't let anything impact us, which is the point I made earlier about that self-compassion. Is it's natural to feel disappointed or angry or frustrated or upset when these things happen. But there's this perception, if it is strength, then, well, I need to be really strong. And when I'm not, I'm weak. Like, we always see it as a kind of one or the other. And if I can't do that, then because I've let it affect me, I'm weak, and therefore I've failed. And that leads us to bottling things up, which, of course, talk a lot around mental health, is not a healthy thing, and means that we're not actually looking to solve the challenges or the problems. We're just pretending everything isn't impacting us and we're okay. It's fine. Like, no, it's fine, when we know, and probably our manager and team knows, that we're not. From there. So it's about being flexible and adaptable. An analogy I use, did a reel about this, is, if you look at a tree, it's not the tree that holds it up, it's the roots underneath. It's how flexible and adaptable they are to situations. So it's telling yourself, it's not about never getting knocked down and never getting like put back on something, but it's how quickly you're able to then adapt to it and go, right, what can I do now? What's in my control and what isn't? And how do I channel my energy into things I can control?
It's almost as though being strong on the outside, looking strong, actually equates to weakness on the inside, isn't it? And
yeah,
by trying to be strong, we are damaging the inside piece, and as a result, we end up with a negative outcome. And I think the males among us, particularly, we know there is such an issue around male suicide rates, male mental health, and I think generally there's an issue as well. But we haven't historically been great talking about it, and there's always been a historical legacy issue there around, got to be strong, come on, be a man about it, and that sort of stuff. And that becomes a a real issue. And what we see is the end result of that is a weakness that's caused by not being able to let things out and not being able to process and to deal with them somewhat.
Yeah, definitely. And again, the more you bottle things up, the more, coming back early to that self-talk and those primitive primal mindset, the more you're going to have those internal battles with yourself along the way.
What about grit? What's grit? What is it?
Grit is, and there's nothing wrong with being gritty. Gritty is, giving up at no cost. It's like, just pursuing something, just going through it and being like, I'm not going to give up until I get this. But of course, as we know, within sales, there's times when pursuing a deal, a conversation, a meeting, an individual, there is times where you actually need to go, do you know what? My energy and time is better spent elsewhere. Or maybe this isn't the right timing for them. Maybe they could benefit from what we're trying to sell them, but it's not the right timing for them. They're not in the right stage of like their change mindset or where they are. And the mindset that when we're talking about grit too much is that people just keep on going because they think, well, this is what I've been told. So, my manager or my company talk about grit, or I've seen my leader talking about it on LinkedIn, is I can't give up. And therefore I need to keep going. And if I fail, it's down to me. It's my fault. Whereas being resilient is knowing when to go and when to pull back and go, do you know what? Let's protect my energy in this case. Let's protect my time here. Because I could try and keep pursuing this person, but they're probably not the right fit. Or I could go and maybe find 2 or 3 other opportunities in the meantime.
Yeah, interesting. And then our final of the 4 is it's not just about ourselves; it's about the people who surround us. Very critical. Talk to me about why is that a myth? Why do people genuinely think it's all within? I've got to do this all by myself.
Yeah, because I think when we talk about, we mentioned at the start, people say you've got to be resilient. And it's very like singular focused of you've got to be resilient, and it's all about we. And the session I went to last night, he was talking about we and me, and he used the example of the Ukraine war, for example, at the moment with President Zelensky, and you saw that picture with all of them, of the defense ministry and everyone like together, and they've created this real strong resilience that is allowing them to sort of push back and achieve some amazing things as well. And then you've got that kind of image of Putin at the long end of the table on his own, like the me kind of mindset. And I think this resembles resilience really nicely, because again, resilience isn't just about individuals. It's about who have you got around you? Who have you got that collective group? And also, how are you thinking about other people? If you are a resilient person and you've developed that over time, when there is difficult situations in the business, are you thinking about how it's affecting other people? You might be thinking, I'm okay, I can handle this, I've been through it before. But it's then important to think, well, how is that person who's maybe the first time they've experienced it? How can I impart my knowledge and wisdom for them to articulate that, hey, this isn't coming naturally to me. Like they might be looking at me going, oh, Owen, he handles these things so well, but they don't know you've been through this 3 or 4 times in the last 18 months. So it's how are you articulating to them going, Chris, it might look like on the face of it that I'm okay, but just to let you know, this is what I felt like when it first happened to me, or how I experienced it, and giving people that perspective.
Cool. I think people watching this be thinking about how my resilience, the me that we talked about earlier, but actually you're making me think about exactly that. How do I influence other people's resilience and ability to get through that? So if I'm an SDR manager, am I thinking I've got to coach resilience? I've got to help people through that, or am I thinking about sales skills? Am I thinking about, and I think the some intent and some consciousness around how you deal with those scenarios and how you talk around that topic is something that a lot of sales leadership probably leaves on the table and forgets about somewhat. So I think it's a really, really valid point. Chris, I'm keen to just dig into some real life examples. So maybe you could talk us through, without obviously any breaching any confidentiality, some of the more common examples of what you're seeing from sales reps, SDRs, AEs in SaaS companies now, where resilience is needed and is needed more than ever. Because I'm guessing you see the same, a number of things happen time and time again when you're in coaching people one-to-one or in groups, and similar questions that come up. And rather than me try to think of what those questions are, it's good to hear from you. What are those common questions that you get from people, and what are the most common areas of their role where they're feeling like resilience is required?
Yeah, and feel free for anyone that's listening, watching, to throw those out there as well. I'm happy to answer some of those on the fly. I think one of the things is, well, how do I deal with everything that's going on outside in the world, basically. You know, you've got the cost of living, you've got Ukraine, as I've mentioned, you've got all these other aspects, you've got the politics in our country. And I think a lot of people are like, you know, it might be influencing my market that I'm trying to sell to. And B, it's impacting me just generally sort of reading all this stuff on a day-to-day. And it's like, that again can create these limiting beliefs of, well, I'm not going to hit my target this quarter, or, you know, we're getting to the end of the year and all this stuff's going on, so people probably don't want to spend money right now. You hear all these limiting beliefs from other people as well, and that's another separate matter, is how do you separate what you believe versus what others tell you?
Yeah.
But coming back to that, I think it's really important to be able to identify, when what I work with people on is what you can and can't control in that situation. Is where are you spending your energy? You mentioned earlier on about that £15. If someone stole £15 from your bank account and you ate £86,400, would you spend the rest of it trying to get it back? Probably not. Well, that's how many seconds there are in each day. And there are going to be a lot of things you can't control. But the more you tell yourself that you should be able to, that's where the more frustration comes from. It's a bit like if I told you, oh, you should be able to push that wall over behind you and you couldn't, you'd feel really stressed and frustrated if someone had told you should be able to, when in reality you couldn't. And that's what we often try and tell our brain is, we'll convince ourselves that because we're thinking about these things, we can do something about it. So in that situation, it's being able to separate what can I and can't control. A really simple exercise, just write it down on a bit of paper. If you're thinking about a deal or who you're selling to at the moment, your ICP, what can I control and what can't I in this situation? And then the things I can control, which are the 2 or 3 things do I have the biggest influence over at the moment? Can I make the biggest change with? So that's one of the things that comes up.
Yeah. I've got some comments here. Lena, I don't know Lena, but she's come on and says, really.
I know Lena.
So you know, there you go. Brilliant. Super useful. Don't know LinkedIn user very well, but good advice, says LinkedIn user. Jordan, great tips to take away. And Neil's posed us a question, which is a really good question. You know Neil anyway. Salespeople are great at selling themselves and will say everything's okay. How can you spot if somebody might be struggling?
Yeah, really good question, and even more difficult in a sometimes more virtual world where you're not always seeing individuals. I think what comes back from this is before you look at signs is creating the space first and foremost, because a lot of the time people won't say anything because they maybe don't feel comfortable or that they can say anything. And I think if this is whether you're unsure if someone is okay or not, I think these kind of things should be common practice, but it's changing the conversation in coaching situations, in one-to-ones, in team meetings, rather than how are you? It's a question that we get asked 15, 20 times a day, and we'll respond very generically with it. So it's again, we talk a lot about, I think sales leaders are very good at giving their teams different ways of asking questions, but not always practicing them themselves. So it's thinking, well, how do I change that question up? So like on a scale of 1 to 10, how have you been feeling recently? Or on a scale of 1 to 10, how have you been dealing with the cost of living crisis? Or how are you feeling about X in this situation? How are you managing this situation right now? What's been on your mind recently? Is giving people that chance to open up as well. I think where you can sort of spot signs is, well, a lot of the time with sales, it might be, you can look at it both ways. It's not always that the person who's struggling isn't performing, because sometimes they will be. Sometimes, going back to what I said earlier on with sports people, they'll kind of deal with this challenge by plowing themselves into sport more. It's the same with sales. Sometimes people might be having a really difficult time at home and therefore think, I'm just going to dedicate all hours of the day to working. And that's where you've got to look at it the other end of the spectrum as well. It's very easy to look at the person who isn't performing, who maybe isn't interacting, but what about the person that's interacting with everything, that is always the first one in, last one out, who's responding to emails at weekends? On the face of it, it looks like the model employee, you know, great, love this kind of person. But you've got to come back to what we said earlier on. What's the intention? What's the reason they're doing this? What's the reason they feel like they need to? And how can they maybe create a more sustainable way of doing it if they feel like it's not impacting there? So I think it's kind of looking at it both ways and looking at those, what we see as maybe overachievers sometimes as well.
Yeah, Karen Seal, really interesting and very helpful. So we're getting some lovely comments from people. Guys, feel free to throw more questions in for Chris. We've got Chris for a little longer. And, you know, if there's specific things you'd like to know more about or get Chris's take on, post your question. I'll make sure we throw it straight at Chris. In the meantime, Chris, you talking there about the environment. So sometimes it's not just about spotting when there's a problem. It's about asking the question when you don't think there's a problem as well. So we're consistent in creating the environment that's comfortable. The phrase preventative maintenance comes to mind when it comes to building a culture, running an organization, running a sales team, that it's not, we don't want a scenario where it's about fighting fires. We offer a free phone line if you've got mental health challenges, because I think by that point, it's got a certain distance down the line. It's, they're taking it seriously enough that they feel like they need to do some kind of self-intervention. There's probably an argument, or there definitely is an argument to say that, a certain distance before that or timeline before that could have been naturally intervened or changed or adjusted if the environment and the support was there. And I'd just love to get your commentary around that as employers, as managers. What can we be doing to make sure that we don't get that far, rather than fighting fires once it gets to a 8 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10?
Yeah, really good question. And again, I think I mentioned to you before, but I think a lot of this stuff I talked about around mental health and supporting employees, it's basic hygiene. It's not a perk. To be honest, it never was. It might have been seen as one, but now it is. This is responsibility, because people are at work more than they are outside of work in their lives. So it plays a big part in there. But I think there's a few things. I think changing that conversation in one-to-ones is a really good way of doing it. I think providing spaces for people to be able to discuss this maybe amongst themselves as well. It's not always about how can I get this person to feel comfortable to go and speak to their manager. How can I create them to feel comfortable to go and speak to their colleague about it? Because Gallup did some really interesting research. I was looking at it today, actually, as a guy mentioned it last night in the talk, saying that the importance of having a best friend at work has actually increased, and has encouraged people to, it's actually reducing churn when people feel like they've got that person. It's not just someone there to go and have fun with, but it is having that person when they're having that tough time that they can go and speak to. So it's not thinking as a manager, I need to be the person who they always need to come to. And if they don't, I'm a bad manager, or, I need to know everything, because that scares managers sometimes. What happens if someone says this and I don't know how to fix it? It's not your job to fix it. It's your job to understand. No, it's not about fixing here at all. It's your job to understand, like, what is it that they're struggling with, or what's on their mind, and who is the best person, or what is the best support system around it as well. But yeah, it's giving people that understanding, that education, so that if someone in their team who's a peer of theirs comes to them, they know how to have that conversation as well. They feel comfortable when to carry that on, or when to suggest, hey, maybe you should go and speak to so-and-so about this as well. So that's a big thing. And then I think it's really just about leaders as well, leading by example and sharing where they see fit. Coming back earlier on to what we said about resilience, of, hey, this is what I experienced last month or last quarter, or when I didn't hit my target, or when this happened with that deal that didn't come in last week, this is what ran through my mind, or what I felt, and this is how I processed it as a result. And it's not thinking that, I think sometimes we have this thought that we've got two scales, and on one side we've got accountability and one side of vulnerability, and thinking that, the more vulnerable we are, the less accountable people are. But that's not the case. They can coexist. You can be vulnerable and still hold people to account. It's as long as you're being vulnerable, but providing an insight into how you move past that challenge, that's important.
Yeah. And, you've almost stolen my next question, which is brilliant, around that management piece, because I think as a manager, you've got your own resilience, challenges, personal life, stresses, anxieties, all the things that come from being human. And often you can easily start to adopt those things of the people in your team somewhat. And just be keen to understand what advice you give to people who are stepping into management for the first time, or are reasonably new to it, and are suddenly realizing that they are everybody's agony aunt, problem solver, fixer, and I think you touched on it there. You don't have to fix it, you got to understand it. But just keen to get some top advice on people stepping into management for the first time, and how they make sure they don't get bogged down with all of not only their issues, but the issues of the people in their team.
Yeah, I mean, just to reiterate that point, I don't need to try and fix everything, because again, what do I tell my teams when prospects have challenges? They're not there necessarily to fix everything. They're there to understand it, first of all. Around that, and not just throw solutions out at people before they've really understood what the challenge is. So I think that's a really important thing. I think secondly, a sort of analogy I use is a bit like everyone's got our own stress container, and this container gets filled up on a daily basis. And when it hits to the top, that's where things like burnout or overwhelm can occur. Yeah. But it's about thinking about what taps do I have to relieve some of that pressure. So as a leader, as a manager, what you should be promoting to your team, but for also yourself, is what are the taps you have to relieve some of that pressure. So do you have your own like leader that you can go and speak to about these things? Do you have ways that you can switch off outside of work, like going for a walk? And are you call them like proactive and reactive ways to recharge your energy? Like energy management is something I've spoken about a bit more recently. Or I say your energy is a bit like your phone battery. Some days you wake up 70%, some days you wake up 20%. You had a long weekend. And the different apps are like your tasks. They'll drain your energy. So how are you recharging it? I mean, for example, it's 2 p.m. on a Saturday. You're going out in the evening and your battery's at 40%. You're probably going to charge it because even though you know you're good now, it's going to die tonight and you're not going to be able to get an Uber. But we don't think about that of our own energy. We think, oh, I'm fine now. I don't need a break. We often wait until we need one, but we wouldn't do that with our phone or laptop. We might do it with our car with the cost of fuel at the moment, but that's not intentional. But it's thinking about how do I build those proactive things into my day to recharge myself, and the reactive ones where maybe I have had a difficult one-to-one and someone has shared maybe some really difficult things to take care of myself.
I feel like you're fast becoming the king of analogies, but I think analogies are fantastic ways in this topic to get people to understand it. And I use an analogy a lot around having a glass of water, and there is only so much water you can fit in that glass or that cup, right? And you have two choices. You either find a sensible mechanism to be able to pour it out somewhere, which ideally would be into some other controllable method, or you keep pouring the water because you can't stop it coming in, right? Because life keeps going, time keeps moving, people want your attention, you need to keep selling, whatever it might be. So you've either got to find ways to distribute it in a sensible, controllable way, or you keep putting it in and guess what happens? You've got no control over where it goes, and there's a mess. And, you know, I'd say that to my guys a lot. Sometimes my glass is just full and I don't have the space for anything new to go in there. And sometimes that being able to distribute is, as you say, going and spending time with family, getting time out of work. Sometimes it might just be walking away for 5 minutes, counting to 90, as you've talked about earlier. It can be a really simple thing. It doesn't have to be a full recharge even. It can be a top it back up a little bit, enough to get you through the rest of the day or the week, and then you know the weekend is coming. And you know, any of these analogies I think are really good just to help people understand it. Neil's actually just thrown another question and said, if you were considering joining a company as an SDR, what would you ask or look for in the interview process? I think it's a really good point because you know, we talk about money, we talk about benefits, all that kind of stuff, but does anyone ask about this when they're considering joining an organization?
Yeah, I think the simple question is how do you promote good mental health in the business? How do you support people? How do you promote the conversation about it? Is a really good way to understand. You know, you can ask about companies' values and so on, but even if a company shares their values, is actually asking, well, what does that mean? Like, what does that mean to you as a leader? Yeah. Or if you get to speak to some of the team, which you sometimes do on the days, what does that mean to you? And just seeing, is that something that's said on the outside but not actually lived on the inside of that experience? And even asking the team as well, like how do they promote good mental health here? How do they take care of you? How do they develop you as an individual rather than just a number? Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to just be a little facetious on purpose, and I'm doing it for the good of the audience and for people to be thinking about this. We are in a fairly unique time in the workplace because naturally we're remote. So you talked earlier about having a best friend at work is really important. Well, for people starting to work in remote, that's likely to take longer to establish. They get less time together, less face-to-face interaction. So it doesn't mean it can't happen, but it's certainly not as easy, I would have thought. But we're also working in a world where we've got a generation of people who have started in a remote world, they want to work wherever they want to work. They want freedom. They want flexibility. They're driven by purpose. You've got a generation of people who are driven by face-to-face contact. They want to go to the pub with their colleagues. They're used to working in the office, and this, and life is about balance somewhat. And then you've got a generation of people who have been in work a lot longer, who are about work. And when we talk about resilience and being open and talking about your mental health, Somewhere, someone somewhere will be using the word snowflake, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think it'd just be interesting to just address that, because not everybody that we work with or come into association with or contact with in work, whether it be client-based, prospects, whatever, will acknowledge what you said today is anything other than that snowflake. Well, oh God, we're just being weak. And I, whilst I'm fully on side with everything you're saying, be interesting to say what would you say to those people that I'm not coining a whole generation here into one, or putting them all into one bucket, but there will be people of all generations that are saying, oh, come on, just be strong. You just got to have a bit of grit. Come on, man up. You'll be all right, Chris. What would you say to those people?
Yeah, I mean, I think I shared a post about this a couple of months ago. I said, back in the day, people would say, crack on, get on with it. And I said, well, back in the day, doctors used to promote cigarettes to patients.
A brandy to babies, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, heroin used to be promoted as cough syrup. So, you look at those things and you look back on it now and you think that's mad, that's mental. Mm-hmm. And we've got to understand that, with evolution and change comes better understanding, and just because it used to happen like that doesn't mean it happens now. And those people might be thinking, well, I'm okay. But again, it's not about me, it's about we. It's about the collective here, and understanding that there's so many different challenges. We didn't have social media 20 years ago where people were constantly comparing themselves to other people on a daily basis. And every time they had some bit of success, they then go online and see someone else having even bigger success, or someone their age doing something else around it as well. We didn't have that feeling of, ironically, feeling more connected, but maybe more isolated at the same time. So I think for those people, everyone is entitled to their opinion, but it's appreciating that just because you feel a certain way or how it worked for you, again, those people often, when you start speaking to them, they might think, oh, I just cracked on with it. Well, was that really the healthiest thing at the time? And how has that impacted you from there? But it's understanding. It's going, look, when we first started talking about physical health, people weren't like, oh, just man up, it's a cold or it's a stomach ache. It's, well, we didn't go, oh, if we start talking about that in the workplace, then people are going to say they've got a cold or they've got the flu and they can't come in. Yeah. And that's what stops people from wanting to talk about mental health as well. People are probably using that excuse at the moment. You just don't know about it. And the danger is that they're not talking about it.
What do you see as some of the biggest threats? And I'm specifically talking about sales. So working in sales now, what do you see as some of the biggest threats to people's mental health working in the industry? I'm guessing there are some individual things, but also some organizational things, rising targets, redundancies coming as we potentially head into recession. There's all these sorts of factors, but what are some of the biggest threats you see?
Yeah, I mean, going back to that Gallup data, I think they found that 29% of people are more burnt out now compared to before the pandemic. Which is, one of the biggest things. And again, it can come from a good intentions. It can come from, there's some really exciting companies to be working for. Obviously, as you've seen the SaaS and tech space, is you're part of something exciting. It's growing. You're like, yeah, I don't want to stop. And that can, of course, go the wrong way. Coming back to earlier on about the overachievers. So I think it's I'm not saying don't celebrate success here. Don't avoid pressure, avoid stress. They're all needed. They're all beneficial things, but it's how to better understand and utilize them. But I think, the more VC backed companies that come in, the more targets increase, the more that is going to happen. And it's again, not stopping those things. It's just looking at how we're providing the tools for it. It's a bit like looking at football, for example, going back to another analogy is if you're playing more games in a season, or if the intensity is getting higher, have you got like the physiotherapist? Have you got football teams now got psychologists in there as well, which you didn't have 10 years ago? We haven't got football players going, oh, back in my day, I didn't need a psychologist as well. We're evolving. We're better understanding what is needed for elite sport, and sales should be seen in the same way. If you're looking to increase the targets, if you're growing, if we're increasing the targets and we're asking more from our people, what kind of tools and framework are we providing them to be able to manage and cope with that effectively?
This will be my last question, unless there's anything coming from the audience. And on purpose, I want to give you a few minutes just to walk us through this. It's a very broad question designed to give you the opportunity to talk about anything I've missed, really. So I guess the question is, what are some other ways to build resilience? So I'm an individual, I'm working in sales. We're acknowledging that resilience can really help me in a number of scenarios. We've talked around how to process and behave and do things in certain scenarios to get a better outcome. But are there any other things that we can do as individuals to help build our resilience?
Yeah, I think one thing is expose yourself to trying new things more. So as you said earlier on with the intelligent failure, if you go into things and say this is an experiment, you can't fail with an experiment. It's an experiment. Rather than, because this is the same with when people are like, oh, I want to work out more, I want to read more. It's like we set this plan and we don't do it. We're like, oh, we failed and it impacts our resilience. But if you go, this is an experiment and what am I going to learn from it? It puts less pressure on it. So I'd say try new things in and outside of work. Try new hobbies that you've had on your mind. Try different approaches on calls. Where you still got the intention of hoping this works. Don't just try something for the sake of it to go, well, it's not going to work, so I want to test my resilience. It's going, I'm going to try this, but I'm going to experiment with maybe this different email approach today or this different cold call. And then I'm going to look to learn from what's happened here. So I think exposing yourself to that. I think proactively seeking feedback is a really good way of doing this as well. Yeah. Feedback is always seen as this negative thing because we often only get it when we don't expect it. And it's sometimes, particularly when it's not done well, it always feels negative. It always feels like, well, there's some nice positive stuff in there, but we're always going to think about the negatives. And it always feels like a shock to the system. If you can proactively go and ask for it, then you can get more comfortable with how you receive it and how you're developing yourself. But also it builds that level of resilience because, again, you're able to take it, understand it, and move past it, which means when you do get it unexpectedly from prospects, from customers, from your manager, from other people, you can deal with it. And I would say with feedback, go and ask your friends, your family, your other half. I mean, I was working with someone, we were talking about feedback, and he asked his girlfriend, he said, you know, how am I doing as a boyfriend? Give me some feedback. And he was like, it's one of the best conversations I've ever had. But we don't ask those questions. We talk about feedback a lot in work, but we don't ask it outside of work as like a friend or family or other half or whatever sort of relationship you play outside of work that is.
God, I'm not going to take that question. Chris, this is fantastic. Thank you so much for spending time with us. I'd love to just give you the opportunity just to remind people who Sales Psyche helps, how you help, and how they can get in touch with you.
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, we support sales and commercial teams. Mind management is kind of how I say it, and mental well-being. Through confidential one-to-one sessions, so talking about some of the topics today, and also in workshops and morning mindset sessions. And then if you want to get in touch, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm actually on a LinkedIn detox this week, which is why you might see me as a bit quiet. I'm sort of practicing what I preach there. Or you can email me, chris.hatfield@salespsyche.co.uk. Not Chris Hadfield, which is the famous astronaut. And if you type my name into Google, it will say, did you mean him? I'm on a personal mission to rank above him SEO by the end of my life.
Love it. Chris, thank you ever so much. As always, really enjoyed learning from you, hearing about your experiences and getting some of your expertise. Thanks to those of you that threw us questions and comments as well throughout the event. This will be on playback, so you can pick it up and watch it if you missed bits. Chris, have a great rest of your day. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Owen. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day. Speak soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.